Hello scapers, board gamers, and painters alike. I am Josiah, better known as Roguescaper, and today we have something pretty awesome to paint. The Hellforge Mandukor. This Heroscape figure is an upcoming release from Renegade, and they were kind enough to send a couple my way so I can get them painted. This metabolic menace is one of my favorite units, both in thematic powers and visual presence. Before we begin, here are the paints and tools I will be using. Certainly feel free to use your own preferred brand with similar colors if you're following along. We're going to be trying to match a scheme for the official art, while also adding a few artistic flourishes to really help this thing pop. So without further ado, let's put on our hard hats, fire up the oven, and paint this Heroscape Hellforge. Now, if you notice, most of the Hellforge is colored in a dark yellow, somewhat akin to construction equipment or heavy machinery. I primed the Hellforge gray, as it's a good middle ground. However, the best method is to use like a colored primer on your model. Army Painter produces several very similar color matching primers that match the colors we'll be using, but you could also find cheap colored primers as well, and they should work just as fine. This allows you to quickly prime and add a base layer with no additional brush work. If you're not using an airbrush, I find this to be the fastest and best way, as it only takes a couple of minutes for complete coverage. Thankfully, I have a couple models to work on, so I'll be able to just demonstrate how to add the brown base layer if you decide not to invest in some brown primer. You'll want to use a large flat edge brush with paint that is thinned down enough so it won't clog the details. I'm using a cheap craft brush with a square head, as the shape will help reduce brush strokes and has a good amount of coverage. After you cover the wide areas, you can go in and use a small brush just to fill in the corners and the harder to reach areas. We're setting our base tone as leather brown. This brown is a great gateway color for us to build up other colors, and any spots you missed will kind of have this brown colored shadow to it, which looks really great on the model. Now that the whole figure has a nice solid coat around it, let's start building up this yellow. Now, yellow is a finicky color. It's a color you want to treat carefully and with respect. That's why we kind of added this nice dark undertone to it. Make the yellow a bit more prominent, we are going to add a dry brush to this whole thing. This method is very similar to slap chop, but it adds a bit more subtlety and dimension to the colors compared to, say, just using black or gray, which is traditionally associated with slap chop. What you're going to do is get some white paint using matte white from Army Painter, mixed out, and put this not onto your wet palette, but onto a dry palette. Whenever you dry brush, which is a thing we'll be using a lot of in this video, you'll want to grab a brush with a nice fluffy head. Now, I'm using kind of more of an official style dry brush, but if you're really looking to get some cheap dry brushes, you can get a package of makeup brushes and use those as well. They work out pretty good as they're kind of designed for similar application. And you're going to want to get a paper towel or a texture palette and remove a lot of the excess from the brush. You can still have it be pretty heavy with the white once applied, but you don't want the whole brush to be filled with it. Really highlight all those raised edges all over the body of the model. This is going to give a strong light point for our next step on this, which will really make it easy, really accentuate it. Try to go around and get all these little nooks and crannies as best as possible. And you may want to add another layer just to make sure it's really bright. You can layer up dry brushing when you paint. Just know that the more layers you add, the brighter it will be on the model. But this we want a bit higher volume. Essentially, we are establishing a very nice gradient for this thing to follow. And this is going to save us a lot of time. Make sure you hit the underside of these arms, as they realistically wouldn't catch any light, but you want just a little bit of brightness to show up there as well.
And since we have the white paint out now, might as well use it to fill in the forge area as well. We're going to be layering more colors onto this, but honestly, it saves some time if you can keep your colors coordinated and paint same colors as much as possible when the paint's already on your palette. Now, white is even thinner than yellow paint, and you're going to want to apply as many layers as it takes to the point where it gets very bright and very solid white for the maximum effect. I think I put around 3 or 4 layers to totally cover the inside of the forge. Now we're going to add a nice dark yellow to this model. We're going to be using Demigod Flames from Army Painter, their War Paint Fanatic line. And make sure you shake this up really good. Especially with yellow, you want these pigments to mix together. And we're going to add a couple drops, enough that we think for the model. And now you're going to grab some medium, some acrylic medium. Traditionally, you want to use the medium for the brand for the most consistent results. At the time of recording, I ran out, so I'm going to be using some from Pro Acryl. But mediums all function relatively the same. Essentially, acrylic medium is colorless paint. It allows the paint to be spread out and is a great way for building glazes, washes, and the like. A lot of fun things you can do with acrylic medium. We are going to add a couple drops of that. About a 1-to-1 ratio if possible. And mix just a tiny bit of water in. About the same, about a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. Always go with less water instead of more water. And you're going to get an old brush that you happen to have on hand. And we are going to mix all these together until it gets a nice thin consistency. You really want to mix this all really well. And notice that I'm doing this in a separate mixing cup. That's just so it doesn't blend in my palette. And I will need to reference this a couple times throughout painting if you happen to make any messes or spills. And once you kind of put it on there, notice it kind of has a nice, add just a bit more water. You want it to flow and hold together, but you don't want it to kind of be too thin where it's almost unusable. This is a nice consistency. It's nice and thick and has good coverage, but still maintains the translucency. Make sure you mix all the medium and the color together, and you're gonna get a good sized brush, and you are gonna apply this to all the yellow parts of the model. Notice how this comes out slightly thinned, and it still kind of maintains these shadows on the model. I'm gonna spread this all around, and it's gonna give a really unique kind of tone progression on this. Notice that the coverage is very smooth. This is allowing, not a lot of unsightly brush strokes or kind of blotchiness to appear in the model, and it's just kind of flowing. Try to avoid the areas with metal on it, if like the metallic parts on it, if possible. But honestly, it's better to have more coverage of the yellow and less of the black, because black is pretty easy to cover over yellow. So just gonna put this all on. This acts very much like speed paint, and honestly, I'm not using it for this model, but speed paint in this kind of situation works really well. And just going through and filling pretty much coloring by number at this point. But we're really liking the smooth coverage and how even it's coming out. That's the really big win here. And because we did this, it will naturally have the kind of areas that weren't hit by the dry brush be more shadowed, and it will have the raised areas be brighter. There are many different ways to paint yellow. This is just one of them that I'm doing for this video. In the future, I probably will explore some other methods of painting yellow, as it's a really fun color to work with, but you do have to be kind of cautious and kind of know what you're doing. This is going to look very strong when you first apply it, but as it dries, it'll get lighter on the model, and you'll have to go back with a couple coats. But notice how we're preserving all these awesome details on the model. We are not, we want as many lines and cracks and crevices to show through as possible. And sometimes when you work with brighter colors, you get impatient and you just kind of cover those details. So this is a great method to ensure that your paint is the right consistency. And honestly, it's a lot more interesting to look at than just starting with white and building up. That's of course a method you could use, but you lose all these subtle shadows that are on the model that are peeking through this transparent part of the paint. And thankfully this thing is just a lot of solid color, so you don't have to be too cautious. It's definitely, as I mentioned, better to cover more area than less area. But like this part right here, we know that there's a lot of going to be metallic, so I'm doing my best to avoid that. But if I get some on it, I'm not going to start over and start fixing it, because I will be covering it with a darker color. And I think about 2 to 3 coats of this will look really nice, with each coat emphasizing more of the top and less of the bottom. Also, this thing is kind of hard to hold. If you notice, I'm trying to paint this bottom area last because this thing is pretty dense. It's pretty solid, and it doesn't hold very well to your standard mini holder, and it doesn't have a lot of room on the base. So I definitely recommend, if you don't want to get paint all over your hands, to try to hold the bottom as best as possible. You may even feel while painting that it's just better just to put it down and hit all the areas that you want on the top, wait for that to dry, and then go to the bottom. Definitely want to look all over this thing, as there are little cracks and crevices that will evade your gaze. That's another advantage of the brown undercoat, is that if you do miss any areas, it kind of will look like rust or grime on the model. Stuff mixed with water and medium takes a bit longer to dry, so you want to factor that in. You want to do a layer and then wait for all that to fully dry. But so far we're looking really good. We're getting some really nice colorization, and it's just, yellow is a fun color, if you treat it with a little bit of respect and a little bit of care and a little bit of just insight. Really want these cracks, as I mentioned, to stay prominent. So if you notice that this glaze is starting to, this is what it is a heavy glaze, is starting to kind of pull up and obscure details, take your brush and kind of spread it around a bit. You definitely want things like that to still have a pretty dark shadow, but you want things like, the shoulder pads of the arms to be a bit brighter, as they're a bit more prominent and more focal points. Once we're all done with this, that brown undercoat may all be layered over, but is, I call, a bridge color. Essentially, it's a color that you can use to build up a bit easier, and it allows you to forgive any areas you miss. I missed this part of the arm. If I said the model was done, you honestly probably wouldn't even notice, just because it looks kind of like some shadow. Definitely try to get inside these deep recesses, which there aren't much of. And definitely make sure you get top of the track right here. You want to have to go back and redo that if possible. Main thing is you want to be hunting for any white spots, any problem areas that just don't seem to be catching your eye as much as you would. The smoother areas will give you a bit more problem, and you want to be patient with those. You don't want to just slap a lot of paint and try to cover it up. If the paint isn't covering, let it dry, and then just go back and add another thin layer that you have on top of it. And once you feel like you have pretty decent coverage on the model, I definitely recommend that you let it dry. Let that all dry, and then add one more layer to it, just to be sure.
So this is looking really good here. Next, we're going to work on the metallic bits. I recommend that you take some black and apply this to the parts that would be metallic. Make it slightly thin, just enough so that it doesn't clog up to the details of the face and the body. And effectively, we are blocking out the colors for our metallics. Also notice there's a lot of coils and things with very thin lines. This method helps to ensure all those lines are appropriately kind of dark. You know, it takes place of a bit of a wash that the wash may not go in there and fill that up. Now, if you want to spend less time on this, you can paint this whole chassis up here black. Just avoiding the yellow parts. I believe that's how it is on the model. But I wanted to see if I could get some separation on this. Just have to be a bit more careful to avoid those yellow areas.
Important thing is to make sure your black paint is not too thin or too runny, as that could have a tendency to overflow into your model. And try to keep your lines nice and thin and solid. If you notice some color peeking through, apply another thin layer over that spot you missed. Notice how I'm working from the top to the bottom. You can kind of do this any way you like, but working on the bottom, I definitely recommend that you paint that and then let that dry before you do anything else. And there's, again, not a very easy way to hold this model. Now you especially want to make sure that this little eye slot is covered, but it is not filled up. That is going to be a prominent visual focal point for the model, and if you have too much thick paint on it, it'll easily cover this up. If you notice the paint isn't kind of coming off as easily, it's starting to kind of stick or kind of come out kind of clumpy, that means that there's not enough moisture on your brush. That should flow out very nice and smooth like that. Again, we are flipping this all angles just to effectively make sure there's no deep shadow areas missing. The claws, make sure you get behind and all over. So with my paint, I am just putting my brush into it, get rid of the excess, and then kind of pulling it out and then rolling my brush like this. So I have a nice control of where the paint on the brush is and where it's going to. So doing that simple roll trick and pulling the paint out is a great way to maintain the consistency of your brush. If you notice, sometimes I also test on my thumb just to make sure it's not too watery or too thick. And sometimes I just like to remove the excess paint that way as well. That's more of an artist quirk I have. You start to develop those the longer you paint, and that's okay. Now this part's going to want to trip you up. Just be very careful and don't rush in this part. Now you may not be able to get the innermost tendrils, and that's okay. For the most part, you got to think you're looking at this model 3 feet away, and for the most part, someone won't even be able to notice that is slightly off color in there. Of course, if you are able to get into it, all the better. I encourage you to try not to get it on the... It's better to not have an area covered and not have that inner part of the Hellforge be covered with black. That would be hard to easily fix. And definitely look at the model upside down, as that is always a great way to see things you missed. Oftentimes I'll finish a model and then I'll take a close-up picture of it and realize, oh wait, I didn't even do half the underside. And I have to go back and fix it, which is a lot harder once you're all said and done. Now, if you're in a situation where the separation is just starting to make it look bad, just go ahead and cover the whole thing. Like, I'd rather have this all be dark instead of be kind of patchy, just because it's so small. Painting this black will just give it a nice shadow. And when you're doing this, you may get small little splotches or mistakes, and you just go back in and kind of cover that up. Use that same thin down paint. Just take your time and layer up those spots back.
And also make sure you paint the tracks underneath the Hellforge, being careful to avoid the metal bar atop of it. And now I'm going to grab some Gargoyle Gray, which is a lovely kind of warm gray, and we're going to put this in for the skin right here.
Want it nice and warm to really separate from the armor we're going to be applying, really make them seem like they're visually different.
Touch up any areas where the paint kind of went into the yellow parts where it's not supposed to be. Also go through and add white to the vents on the side, lower parts, and back parts of the model. And you'll want to add a couple layers to those areas, making sure that they're as bright and white as possible. If you got any yellow into the white forge, make sure you layer that back up as well. Alright, and your model should look like this when it's all finished. All the colors properly blocked in. Kind of a clear idea where everything's at. We're going to grab gunmetal and mix this with a little bit of the black, just to make it a bit darker. And we're going to do what's called a moist brush, or a wet dry brush, essentially. We're going to take this paint, put our brush onto it, and we're going to go against the grain of the model so that these areas still remain dark on the tendrils and the coils and all that stuff. But it's still got some nice consistent coverage. As if I want to use a small brush with this, that's definitely older, not your best. As we are essentially letting this dark undertone really paint the model for us. We spent a lot of time getting here, but now that we're here, we can kind of enjoy the fruits of our efforts. Now, the term moist brushing isn't really a common phrase, it's more an expression I personally use. I'm pretty much using a dry brushing motion on the metallic parts, but not going through all the effort of removing the full excess from my brush or keeping it dry. I want a bit of moisture so the metallic paint flows easily and smoothly onto the model. However, you could also use a standard dry brushing method for this as well. It'll give it more of a textured and kind of gritty look, which you may want for the Hellforge. Same technique, just kind of want to go up and down against the grain of the claws. Now for these more smoother cylindrical parts, you just want to kind of cover the outermost layer. And I'll leave that inside still dark, if possible. Or you can kind of dry brush the back. Now for this, we are just going to straight up dry brush and very carefully just go against the grain of this. Taking our time and just really bringing that sparkle to the machine. Let's fill them in completely. Being especially careful to avoid the rest of the model. And notice that these little black tips we leave like that. Make sure you get inside the claws using the side of your brush. Just use, really want some separation there. As you see, this black undercoat is really making this nice and strong on the model. The areas you miss still look like they have a little shadow in them. It's very forgiving. And when you paint the head, just make sure you go against the texture of the spines, kind of going straight in a downward motion. You may want to focus a little bit more on the crevices, as this is a high focal area, and you don't want too dark shadows to distract from the overall look of the model. As always, remember you can layer up your dry brushing and go back if an area starts getting too dark. Maybe even using a mixture of less black mixed into the gunmetal with each pass. And then we are going to take some plate mail metal and just very briefly dry brush over the top of this on the outermost top parts. So now we've established a very strong base coat for this model. I want to go through and add some further shading, dimension, and depth to this. So let's start adding some wash to the model. Okay, so first we're going to add a nice strong tone from our painter as our first shade. We're going to be using multiple shades, which is a great way to kind of add some subtle distinctive hues. Make sure you shake it up really well, and we're going to thin this down just a little bit. Not too much, because Army Painter does have a tendency to kind of coffee stain and splotch. But we don't want to ruin all this nice work. And you're going to focus on the areas and add this nice grime to it. Strong tone is kind of like a nice orange black, and it's really going to make this thing look effectively like it's been used a lot. Now, let's say you have kind of the wash start to stain or show up in spots you want to be more visible. You can put some water in your brush and start kind of spreading that around and absorbing it. Notice how it goes into like the recesses and really fills those in. And it covers up a little bit of our mistakes or areas that we may have overlooked. I would try to avoid the metallic parts, as we are going to use a different color tone for that. We want this thing to have very distinctive parts, because there's not a lot of colors on this unit. There's not a lot of ways to individualize things, so let's kind of keep it separate with these shades we're using. Army Painter quick shades have a filtering effect to them. They almost act as like semi-glazes, and they will kind of blend these colors together. And important thing is just watch for like pulling that looks a little weird. This will dry a lot brighter than it initially comes out. So if you're worried a little too much about this, the whole thing kind of becoming too muddy, don't worry, this will eventually brighten up a bit after it dries. Definitely hit these arms, going against the grain. Areas where I expect there's more grime, I'm applying on a bit heavier, specifically the lower areas kind of around the treads, as those realistically would have the most dirt and buildup. But you still don't want this stuff to pull up like that, as it just doesn't look good on the finished model. I think it's kind of tacky and gross. Flat surfaces, you might want to spread it around so it doesn't pool on weird. This is a very satisfying model to shade. I'm currently holding it face down so all the wash flows downward in the correct direction. There's just so many little details that if you don't apply a shade will really be lost. And honestly, would be hard to bring out every single one of these by traditional layering. This heavy shade is very classic Heroscape inspired, and you know, it's the easiest way to make your model look like it's a old classic Heroscape piece, while still looking pretty great as well.
All right, and now that we're gonna let that all dry up, and then we are gonna go through and start adding some more shading to this figure. We've added a strong tone. Now let's work on adding a dark tone. Now let's work on adding a dark tone to the metallic parts to add a separation of hues and make this silver parts look really deep and interesting. This is a really fun model to work with, as there's just a lot of simple techniques you can use to really kind of bring out the inherent detail associated with this thing. Just more darkening these recesses, just to really add a bit of sharp and punchy contrast. I assume were the actual parts of the Eisenach's arms, just to kind of darken them down a bit and bring out those little details on it. You don't want to overdo it, you just want to add a little bit of shade to the model. Notice I'm not applying that too thick, I'm kind of spreading it around. Again, we're going for this grimy, dirty look, and this is why the washes are an effective tool. On a standard model, you probably wouldn't use as much as I'm using now, but I really like making this thing look like it's been around the block, so to speak. If you apply your washes in kind of thin, it adds just a bit of a dark tone to the metal, which is what we're looking for. Try not to get this onto the yellow, if at all possible, as you do want these to look individual. You're going to let that dry for a bit before moving on to the next step. Now to work on the Hellforge itself of the Hellforge. We're going to grab some prismatic bolt speed paint. We're going to do a really easy method for this. Not going to spit out like anything complicated that involves airbrushes, but just something that will catch the eye. And we are going to apply the speed paints to this area. Then when you make sure that you cover that whole area up, speed paints inherently work great for this because they will put shadow in the recesses and bring out the brighter spots. If they go around, make sure you get the corners. You want a nice even layer for this. But while we wait for that to dry, let's hit these little back areas as well. And get these little areas on the side as well. Using a brush with a very narrow tip, you want to try to add a thin white line for the little eye mask as well. And if you want to, after that speed paint dries, you can go through and add just a little white dot in the center of these spots in the back, just to make them look a bit more like they're glowing. If you overdo it, don't worry, just add another layer of speed paint to it. Remember, with bright highlights, less is more. Don't want to overdo it, lest the whole thing appears white, but and just apply the speed paint over that eye area as well.
Once all your shades and color effects have kind of dried up, I would recommend that you go through, if you find your model to be a bit too dark, and add a slightly brighter yellow to the model. I'm using Fiendish Yellow from Army Painter just to really buff up those corners and curves that kind of may have been lost in this process. Thinly apply it just to kind of the topmost part of the model, being careful to avoid that metal we already put down. And here's the finished model with a few of those extra added steps to it, just because it was so much fun and I kind of couldn't stop painting it once I started. If you want to get the Hellforge for yourself, be sure to check upcoming Renegade releases, as this will be releasing soon. And, it's a great Heroscape piece to add to your collection. And just due to the structure of the model, the kind of skills we used, and the ways you can just kind of build this model up, all in all, I just gotta say, the Hellforge Mandukor is a blast to paint. You all take care now. Bye.